Welcome everyone, Dr. Thor here. Get ready for Gnosis. Well, as my continuing investigation into the Temple of Set and Satanism in general, I've always wondered why the Church of Satan had a certain celebrity following and how did they actually join the church or become members. We have James Mansfield, and it's unknown of how she actually became a, quote, member, apparently was semi-active. We just don't know, and we can't really believe anybody. That's what life is all about. Ifs, ands, maybe, it appears. This is what life is all about, and we need to understand that because people just lie, misinterpret, state what they think is the truth. It goes on and on and on. I still can't find a credible researcher other than myself. Now, the information I'm going to give to you comes from the horse's mouth again. This comes from an actual interview from Michael Aquino, the founder of the Temple of Set and longtime member of the Church of Satan. So it comes from the horse's mouth. This is an actual interview. As I report with most items, that I have verified it as directly as possible. Now, whether it's the truth or not is another thing. It's this person's statement of what happened. Is it true? Well, we have to wonder there, but it makes sense, and we got to take people's opinions as 80% of what's really happening, even though these things tend to be modified to fit whatever little puzzle piece they need. But how do people join organizations like this? Now, the Church of Satan had a few noticeable people, even a, quote, congressman, I believe, at one time, several movie stars, and lots of people who like to carry that card. It was the bad boy card. Let's smoke it a dope and have it the orgies card. And, of course, this has always been a popular area to get into and something that people have always been into. Now, what actually went on with these organizations, what the people leading it actually believe, gets to be mired in a lot of bad information. Organizations are notoriously blamed for what a few bad apples in a group does. And this is really sad. The fact is, somebody joined your organization, and they were open to anybody could join the Church of Satan. Anybody can join my organization. It's not really a membership, but you can get your membership. You pay your money. Do I know who you are? Why don't? You go out and you do something bad and you say, well, I did it because Dr. Thor told me. Well, that's how you get labeled poorly, where you had nothing to do with it. And the Church of Satan, the Temple of Set, is kind of similar, even though the Temple of Set requires a little more involvement with its actual members, so it appears. But how do people join? And how do celebrities in particular? They're busy. They got things going on. Does it really help them? Well, what we're going to talk about here is Sammy Davis Jr. Certainly somebody from my generation. I'm in my early 60s, and someone people would know who are in their 60s and 70s, which means most people probably don't know Sammy Davis. I don't know how far back it goes if you're in your 40s, etc. But Sammy Davis was part of the infamous Rat Pack with Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra, etc. He had a lot of songs even on the radio in the 1970s and had a few best sellers or hits, top 10 songs, I believe, in the 70s as well. But he was a well-known, he did movies, etc. And, of course, one of those, which I came to find out, is half Cuban black that he is. So he hid his Cuban background because of prejudice in the 1960s against the Cubans. On top of being black and being Cuban was apparently not good because of the stress between what the idiot Kennedy did to almost cause a nuclear war with Cuba, of course, backed by Russia. And that's another issue, but something that should be learned by people of what really went on there. More lies were told. So Sammy Davis is an interesting guy. And why would he join the Church of Satan out of the blue? Well, I'm going to keep this relatively short. I think it's important to get some fascinating facts. His parents' actually name was Sammy Davis Jr. Sr., and his mother was Elvira Sanchez, and this was from actual... So he wasn't actually 100% African American. He had, from what I understand, Cuban, as I've just mentioned. But it's interesting that that's what his mother's maiden name was Sanchez, so he was half Cuban or half Latino, however you want to look at that. We need to understand that, of course, of course, we cannot overlook his time frame, the fact that he's black, etc., of what's going on in his life. This is a horrific time in American history with a horrible prejudice against people just because of their skin color, which goes on to this day as well. It's interesting that the blacks are still shot down in the street by fascist police officers and nothing is done about it. And, of course, this still goes on in the prejudice out there, which nobody seems to do anything about, including a black president who ignored the entire issue of being black. After all, I'm not sure he was black. He was from Waikiki, baby, surfing all day, and came from a pretty wealthy family, and, of course, went to that black school called Harvard. So we all need to understand that. But that's quite different. And, when you read history here, it's pretty much shocking. Of what was really going on here at these particular times. It's really frightening. But, people don't also understand the fact that even the Pentagon has separate bathrooms for black people. There were separate bathrooms for Native Americans. This went even into the late 70s in many government buildings. This is the kind of filth out there of the corrupt criminal supremacists that really aren't even, quote, white, because most of them are Arabs, because that's where they come from, otherwise known as Aryan, to understand that. So it's just really the terrible thing. It was actually Roosevelt who, once the Pentagon was built, said that they would not use those horrible bathrooms and segregate people, but they were built there. Isn't that interesting as a bit of trivia? Now fold that up and put it into your little special pocket, as I like to say. As I mentioned, he was a performer, a singer, had a great voice, was a great tap dancer, known for his renditions, particularly in 1970 variety shows on TV, of Mr. Bojangles. So, he was also known for his big hit, The Candyman, which was taken in the 70s to mean your drug dealer, but not really, but yes, really. But that's how it all goes. He gained a lot of fame and notoriety by becoming a member of the Rat Pack, led by Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, Joey Bishop, who is Jewish, and, of course, Peter Lawford, whose brother-in-law was JFK, for all of you who don't know that, because now it's kind of old history. Sinatra originally called the Rat Pack the Klan, but Davis voiced his opposition, and Sinatra renamed the group the Summit, so it says on Sewerpedia. Apparently, Andy Dickinson, remember Policewoman, based after a soft porn movie, but a good series, and I believe it was the 70s that I used to watch all the time, approached the group, and she said, you look like a bunch of rats. And from that point on, it became the Rat Pack. Interesting little bit of history that I didn't even know that she was, where that name came from. But it is kind of funny when you get into these things to know the where all this comes in, who's involved with it, etc. So, but there's so much weird stuff that goes on in history that people don't appreciate, and particularly young people don't understand the kind of horrible oppression that black people went through. You couldn't stay in hotels. You had to go to a black hotel. You had a black restaurant. This is America. This is where we had the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nations who spoke so much about freedom while they were owning all these slaves. This is the strange reality that America is. So life is very weird and very changing. So we need to understand all this, and people need to look back and know what the past is and never forget the past, or it will repeat itself much worse. And that's what's happening today. Why our ministers, our politicians aren't out there setting up commissions and arresting people who murder people on the street in the name of your society is just unbelievable. But we do this all the time. We have millions of homeless. 33% of the American children live in poverty. We have over 20 million people living on the streets, but we're going to give billions to the corrupt, horrible government called the Ukraine, ran by a mobster. So the whole idea is we're going to do that. We're going to start World War III. We're going to jack up all the prices for a criminal country because another country who basically owns the Ukraine invaded it to take it back. You know, like we did with Texas and California and Oregon and Washington and on and on. And Florida, which was owned by the Spanish as well. So I don't think people know much about Davis, and he did convert over to Judaism as well. And of course, he jumped around like so many people trying to find himself, particularly being a person legitimately that was pried upon. Fortunately, he had money to avoid certain things, but not entirely. It's very interesting. Even a celebrity like him and the kind of shenanigans that went on. But in 1954, Davis almost died in an automobile accident near San Bernardino, California. He was making a return trip from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. During the previous year, he had started a friendship with comedian Eddie Cantor, Carrie Fisher's father, I believe, who had given him a Methuselah. How do you pronounce that? Instead of putting it at his door as a traditional blessing, because that's what the Jews do. They do this little Methuselah, however it's pronounced. I always have trouble with all this in general. But Davis wore it around his neck as good luck. So you usually put this by your entry door because then it blesses and keeps evil spirits out. And this is very typical of a Jewish traditions. The only time he forgot it was the night of the accident. So he was wearing this all the time since Eddie Cantor, a famous singer, comedian, etc. I believe he married a famous actress. Boy, I'm having a problem with remembering things right now. But the only time he didn't wear it was when he actually forgot it the night of this big accident he got in. And it was a bad accident. And apparently he impacted another car. Apparently, when a driver missed turning at a fork, backed up her car, which is what a strange is. This person stopped, backed up their car into Davis's lane, and Davis drove into her car. So somebody backed up because they missed a ramp or a street right back into his lane. He ran into her, obviously. And consequently lost his left eye to a bullet-shaped horn button. That was standard in the 1954 and 1955 Cadillac. So it just shows, all these little things on steering wheels in your cars. The reason why there's so many safety features is that these things can cause problems. So apparently it jammed it into his eye, and of course, that was the end of that eye's tune. So from that point on, he was in the hospital where he was getting treatment. Eddie Cantor showed up to Davis again and gave him the similarities between the Jewish and black cultures. Davis, born to a Catholic mother and a Baptist father, began studying Jewish history, converting to Judaism several years later in 1961. So this happened in 54, so it took him several years before he actually converted over to Judaism. So it wasn't just instantaneous. And that's interesting that this is the way he entered into Judaism. A fascinating little story of getting this particular blessed item and treasuring it and then forgetting it one day, and it turned into a serious and deadly situation of losing one of the senses that you are the most important to you, at least part of it, which is your sight. So that's how he got involved in Judaism. Now, he was Jewish at the time that the Church of Satan approached him. And what happened was, to make a long story short, but I'm going to cover one other thing before I get into that. And that is the fact of some of the most outrageous things that could be possibly happen that just seem to be totally out of reality now, but on the other hand, is not. In 1957, Davis was involved with actress Kim Novak, a very beautiful, quote, white woman, apparently of Czech ancestry. She was not Jewish from what I can find at a brief check. Harry Cohen, the president of Colombia, gave in to his worries about the backlash against this. Now, this is 1957. You got to remember this is pretty much as backward as you can get in the United States and as hateful as you can possibly get, which has even continues to this day. But apparently that it comes out that Davis, because of his engagement to and involvement with Kim Novak, that he was threatened by organized crime figures. Can you believe this? So apparently Cohen, the head of the studios, called racketeer John Rossetti, who was told to inform Davis that he must stop seeing COVID. Interesting that this Italian mob people of questionable ancestries, being lower Italians or Arabs, would be involved in who is whiter. It's the kind of the same joke that the Nazis, who are basically Arabs, would say they're white. To try to scare Davis, Rosselli had him kidnapped for a few hours. So they actually grabbed Davis for a few hours and held him. This is organized crime, of course, which, of course, is ass-licked by all your feds, of course, and your locals who are afraid of them. Another account relates that the threat was conveyed to Davis's father by mobster Mickey Cohen. And it's interesting to note that, of course, Cohen, and to think that all mobsters are wops, there's plenty of other mobs, and there's plenty of Jewish mobsters, which is interesting as there is still today. So Davis was threatened with the loss of his other eye or a broken leg if he did not marry a black woman within 2 days. So Davis sought the protection of Chicago mobster Sam Giancana. Of course, you'd go to another mobster to protect yourself. The authorities aren't going to do that. They're too busy burning crosses on people's lawns and getting their little envelopes full of cash. Who said that he could protect him in Chicago and Vegas, but not in California. So apparently, Sam Giancana came to the rescue of Sammy Davis and said he had some protection in Vegas and Chicago, but not anywhere else. Davis briefly married dancer Lorraine White in 1958 to protect himself from mob violence. Can you imagine that? Davis had previously dated White, who was 23, twice married, and had a 6-year-old child. He paid her a lump sum of $25,000 to engage in marriage on the condition that he would resolve it before the end of it. So it was totally sham and had a contract. Apparently, if this is true, Davis became inebriated at the wedding and attempted to strangle wife en route to their wedding suite. Nothing like marriage bliss. So, checking on him later, Davis's assistant claimed that Davis had a loaded gun to his own. Davis despairingly said to, "Why won't they let me live my life?" The couple never lived together and commenced their divorce. But this was kind of a way to show that he was doing how the masters of this world really are, which is the organized crime, which I've always said. Criminals run the world, and anybody that thinks it's different should talk to the Medellin cartels and find out who runs stuff in Mexico and the United States and everything else. What's interesting, in 1960, there was a radical change of public controversy when Davis married white Swedish-born May Britt in a ceremony by a rabbi at the Temple Israel of Hollywood. While interracial marriages have been legal in California since 1948, there were still 23 states didn't allow intermarriages. And a 1958 opinion poll found that only 4% of Americans supported marriage between blacks and whites. And that's in 1958. So we got to remember that, and how radical, how weird and all that was doesn't matter. But this is the kind of stuff was going on. I just want to give you a background, and people should understand that we haven't come very far. Well, we have a lot of wealthy black people now, a lot of black people in points of position. They do like everybody else. They seem to fade into the controllers and do what they're told. The only person that I know of that has helped other blacks of all people is Magic Johnson, who has built stores and theaters and everything to service the black community and seems to work with them. Nobody else seems to do anything. You become rich and you become the rich race, and that's what it's all about. But it just shows you that here's a guy who wanted to, who is linked to a white woman in possible marriage. And of all people that came out was the fact that the mafia came out, the little Guidos, who are mostly low-level Arabs, came out, and which is fits. I mean, when you fit all these people like the Aryans, the low-level Arabs, Italians, well, they're all Arabs. They all come from that Islamic hate factor. So all of this is the fact of what's going on. Now let's get back to the actual Temple of Set, and we'll get back into what he died in and get a few things there. Of what happened there. So apparently Sammy Davis Jr. in the, I don't know, it was the 70s, did some sort of TV movie, which he was playing some sort of manipulator. It was a comic movie. Some sort of person who was being manipulated by the devil into certain comic situations. And it was mentioned in the script there that, well, if we want to contact Satan, we should probably go over to the Church of Satan, and this is a good way to do that. So this movie, and of course, you got to remember television in the 1970s was it. Everybody watched television, and the entire country did. This was the main medium. TV movies was big. As a matter of fact, the amount of people going to movies was very small. And actually, there was termed in the late 70s the death of Hollywood because people weren't going to movies anymore. They were watching television. After all, it was free. There was great diversity. This is when the movies started to get more sexy and violent, trying to attract people that you couldn't see on TV. So apparently, Colonel Michael Aquino, who seems to know an awful lot about the media and watches everything, but I guess that's part of what he does as a psychological psyops person. You know, what are people thinking? What's out there? How do you use these kind of medias to manipulate people? Well, apparently he's watching it because he talks about movies all the time, in-depthly and details about them. And I think that he's trying to figure out what the public is being subjected to. But regardless of all that, he was watching this, and he saw this statement, and he contacted Anton LaVey, which we're not sure how close or not they were, but he certainly was a high-ranking member of the Church of Satan until they broke up basically over Anton's wanting to monetize the church, which I don't see anything wrong with if it's done properly. But for a Boy Scout badge-winning guy who wants to get all sorts of certificate types, this couldn't be any higher of an offense. I worked for the priesthood. I want my little ticket. I want my badge. I want my etc. This was the greatest insult, and that anybody who worked for titles was disregarded. Of course, this is true if you're going to sell them, but there's also a real world out there to try and build a church and bring people in. But it wasn't just selling them. He wanted to be able to give noted people accreditation in the church for past work, which I do myself. If you come to me and want a degree in the occult sciences or radionics or anything else, I'm more than happy to give you a degree if you can prove to me that you've written books or in the industry, have years of experience. Why not? Why should you be starting at step one with the complete bogus novice when you spent 10, 20 years doing whatever? So, you know, people that achieve anything immediately can be put up on higher. So this was part of it. Aquino likes to play that down, saying he just wanted to sell things. I don't know. And apparently, Aquino just stomped his feet and left. Now, for somebody who's so close to someone else, there doesn't seem to be any discussion of what they get now. There is a discussion in his book on the Temple of Set where shows his more removed status from Anton LaVey. And his mediocre suggestions, being a rich officer with money left from mommy of over $3 million, that he wasn't helping his organization. Nor did he come in and say, well, Anton, let's try and get you a stronger salary, because Anton made very little money to nothing. At the time of his divorce, he was stating he had a $20,000 a year income, which was mediocre even back in the 70s and 80s. Certainly wasn't a lot. Certainly wasn't poverty level, but it wasn't. So he wanted to monetize things. He eventually lost his house through a divorce. He had nothing when he died, and he died pretty much penniless. So the fact that he wanted to make a little bit money and cash in on this is certainly something he should have done. But being a poor businessman, he was unable to do this very well. But wanting to cash in, I see nothing wrong with that. And I see that being very satanic, pragmatic. So, but this, of course, to a badge winner was the greatest insult, which is what Michael Aquino was. So to give you a little bit of background there, but it was Michael Aquino. He talked to LaVey and he said, why don't we give him a free membership? That sounds a little strange here. I don't know what level this membership is. I don't know if they made him a priest or a higher level. Well, that's what Anton wanted to do. So it's kind of controversial or questionable here unless we get into more details of it. You know, what position was he offered for free? And it was free. And he didn't come to the church saying, I want to join. He didn't come there with any backgrounds other than the fact that I'm a celebrity. I did a movie. What does that mean? So the guy was Jewish. He was not involved in anything else. So what does that mean? I mean, there's quite a few Jews in the Church of Satan anyway, and even in the Temple of Set, who later took it over and still there. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but we should note that. There's no high ground anybody has. So the whole idea is everybody's involved in everything, and this is part of the nonsense. But it is interesting considering that Aquino and his organization are very Nazi-based, and they just welcome in Jews and even let Jews take over the Temple of Set, which Don Webb did, and so many other people in his organization. His daughter married a Jew. So, and here we got these people who have Nazi areas of their particular. This is the same old nonsense you run into all these things are. But I guess the fact that the Nazis were really just Arabs didn't bother anybody either. But so as we move into these things, we need to fully understand what's going on here. And Sammy Davis is an interesting character. So he joined this after talking with his friend about Judaism and everything else that happened. So Michael Aquino approached him, and of course, he was able to, with his connections or whatever it is, they were able to get a hold of Sammy. And how this all happens, I don't know. Because if you want to talk to somebody, you have to go through their agent and tell them you want to talk with them. So how they made arrangements, I don't know. I don't know if Aquino, using his particular contacts in the police department, etc., was able to access him, but it doesn't matter. He talked with Anton LaVey, and he agreed to give him this free membership into the Church of Satan, and that's what Aquino did. Aquino went down there, met him, and had met him on several occasions from what he states in other interviews. So he met Davis, they chatted, and I think Davis was just being pragmatic. He didn't put any money into the organization. He didn't help the organization. They did use his name somewhat, which did help the organization. In his autobiography, Sammy Davis doesn't go into his actual contact with the Church of Satan very much, but he does state that, I know a lot of people and have some good friends in the Church of Satan, and that's how he leaves it. So he doesn't go into any further details there. But we certainly, it's hard to blame him to connect with anybody he can for personal power, etc., since he was threatened with murder and harassing him to the highest degree, etc. But of course, he did have money to go along with that. So that's very important to understand, that he was able to bridge some of this horrific problems because of the fact he had money, he had connections, and all the things that go with it. But that's how it happened. He didn't voluntarily go to the Church of Satan, ask for membership, call anybody. He didn't make the first move, is what I'm saying. So this was something that was offered to him at some level that we're unsure of at what level that was, that Michael Aquino made him an honorary member and then met with him because he was a singer and a Hollywood guy. Certainly not what I would consider, of course, a noted, talented performer, but, this isn't some great intellectual and so forth with Aquino seems to love so much. So they approached him. He willingly got involved. They had their connections. And of course, I believe Davis was doing this very pragmatically. Well, these are just more people we know. And the fact of that Aquino could state that he was a military officer showed his personal influence, which helped people open up to him or talk to him. The fact that Anton LaVey was known in Hollywood, he did some guest spots and was worked on some Hollywood films. They threw him into different spots in different movies, etc. But none of this pays anything. People think that Hollywood makes you rich. Well, it does if you're heavily connected, but not if you get little bit parts. 98% of the Screen Actor Guild makes under $20,000 a year. So that's pretty shocking for an industry. So we need to understand that. So there was an opening then. It was still that time that these things were kind of funky. Now, to dig up a little negativity on Sammy Davis, well, he has admitted himself in his autobiography that he was a sex addict and a drug addict. And he had all these problems. So this was probably seen by him as another way to fulfill some of his drugs and sexual needs. And we don't know what on past that. But certainly that's what the Church of Satan was seen as. It was seen as a party church. Now, how many people took it seriously? I frankly doubt it. It was something that, hey, let's go to the latest orgy. Let's get loaded. And that's, of course, what was there. Now, there were some higher, more intellectual types like Aquino and Anton LaVey, but you got to remember the masses of people involved there were completely, totally there for the party. And it never grew in any interest. Neither did the Temple of Set, neither did the Church of Satan. There's no satanic organizations out there that are really huge amounts of memberships. There's a lot of people out there that somehow think there's power there, buy books and other things by the local Satanists of today, but this is just plain and simple facts of things with most organizations. So it doesn't appear that he gave a lot of money, that there was any kind of great information, exchange of information, contacts, etc. He didn't bring in any other people that I'm aware of that were Hollywood stars that joined, at least not anything publicly. So he didn't do anything except, hey, yeah, I'll be part of that. That's cool, dude. I don't know. I'm not sure what the exact thing was there. And certainly there may have been some appeal to a guy who was heavily involved in sex addiction, pornography, and drugs, that this was kind of a fun thing. What can I get out of it? Bro. And as I said, there's nothing in his autobiography that states anything in depth, because this would be very problematical to the publishers, obviously. So that's all, and that's pretty much where it's sat. After that, Sammy Davis reaffirmed his belief in Judaism and got heavily involved in that. And while I don't know if he ever canceled membership in the Satanic Church, he generally didn't seem to do anything of great involvement, bring anybody in, give any money that we're aware of. So what happened with him in August 1989, developed symptoms of throat cancer, basically. Doctors found a cancerous tumor in his throat. And, of course, this is a singer. He was a heavy smoker and often smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day as an adult. Apparently, they had to remove his larynx to stop the spread of cancer, meaning that he was probably unable to speak and certainly unable to sing. And this happened in March of 1990. Davis died of complications from throat cancer 2 months later at his home in Beverly Hills on May 16, 1990, at the age of 64. So he died pretty young. 64 is very young, even in 1990, as still people averagely live to about 84, 85. So because of a heavy smoking habit, apparently caused all this throat cancer, which is kind of an old story. So Davis had an estate of about $4 million to his widow, Alpha Vive, but he owed the IRS over $5 million, which after interest was about $7 million. So she had to auction everything off to pay the bills for all of these things. Of course, there's still money coming in from his intellectual rights, his people that want to use his songs and all the other things. So his son Manny was named executor in 29 to take over his estate and so forth. So that's the actual story of Sammy Davis Jr. in general. I think it's interesting. People should know the background of it. People should know the kind of horrific things that went on and are still going on. And while it never really changes, and while there is a certain black class, they seem to ignore the fact. You don't have a lot of black police officers, which are many of it, coming off talking about this murder of their people, the horrible things that are done through these things, even consistently, the constant abuse and murder of United States citizens. And that's really what it's all about. You know, they murder the black people on the streets, they murder the white people in the prisons, and that's how it works, where they set up people to murder you if you're not one of their people. We see this from Epstein to the scientists in the Gulf spill, who there were 7 or 8 of them who were arrested on bogus charges, and many of them were murdered in prison. But they don't go up to their house and shoot them because that's too out there. But they do that with poor black people, and that's the way it is. So it's an inequity in the system that isn't really centered entirely on whites, on blacks, but the bottom line is it goes across the board, and everyone should be fully aware of these things. So it's an interesting story. It's an interesting story of how, I always wonder, how does someone happen? You hear Sammy Davis Jr., and you see pictures of him. Well, what really is it? Well, it's really not pictures of him as a participatory person. They showed up. He granted them interviews, or at least met with them for whatever he thought he could get out of that, which, as I mentioned, I think was more of the sex and drug reality that he's hoping to get there. I think maybe he found something curious about it. I think everybody finds that curious, but this wasn't someone who went to the church, joined, and gave a lot of money, and we need to understand that fully. Hopefully that clears up everything. Until next time.